Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. We meet again in our course, Life Science course, and this time we will talk about Introduction to Cell. What is a cell? The definition of cell is the simplest unit of living matter or organisms, like our body as human, or animal or plants are composed by multi-million cells. And there are some classification of cells and what are its organelles. We will talk more deeply in this session. Okay, first one we talk about type of cells. We have we have two type of cells. The first one is prokaryotic, and the second one is eukaryotic. The prokaryotic cells is cells without a nucleus. This type is the simplest one of cells. Mostly, prokaryotic cells contain a single cell organism like bacteria or amoeba, etc. uh, in prokaryotic cells, there is no distinct nucleus, so the nucleoid is separate, doesn't have membrane of in nucleus. So the DNA is concentrated in nucleoid, which is unseparated from other components like ribosome, uh, other organelles. So it's in cytoplasm uh, unseparated. The second one is eukaryotic cells. Eukaryotic cells is cell with a distinct nucleus, so it have specifically nucleus, which separated by a membrane, nucleus membrane, from other components. The eukaryotic cells mostly found in animals or plants or humans like us. Okay, next one. This is the difference between animal cell and plant cell. The animal cell just have plasma membrane to protect its organelle. So it is more flexible, but its membrane is thinner than plant cell. Different with animal cell, plant cell has more protection because it has cell membrane and cell wall. But because the cell wall is thicker than membrane in animal cell, so it's more rigid and not flexible if we compare with animal cell. The other specific organelle in plant cell is chloroplast. Plant cell has chloroplast, which can proceed photosynthesis process, so they can make or they can produce a food for itself, and also it can produce this food to the others or animal, etc. So why plant can be in our ecosystem become producent, not consuming. Okay, next we talk about cell organelle. We have different kind of cell organelle. The first one is cell membrane. The function is to protect cytoplasm or organelles inside cell from environment outside cell. The cell membrane actually is semi-permeable membrane, which can be filtered or select which kind of minerals or other chemical compound can enter or exit from cell. The next one is cell nucleus. If we talk about cell nucleus, we must think like the cell nucleus is brain of nucleus, because cell nucleus contain chromosome which store genetic material, or we say DNA of cell, and the function is control all of cellular activities. The third is endoplasmic reticulum. The endoplasmic reticulum is at the position is outside of nucleus, and actually the function is to store both calcium, also synthesize protein, and metabolism of lipid. Why endoplasmic reticulum can synthesize protein? Because it has ribosomes. This ribosome contain some enzyme which can synthesize protein. Okay, next one is Golgi apparatus. The Golgi apparatus can transport, sorting, and modification of protein and lipid. So when endoplasmic reticulum produce or synthesize protein and lipid, next one it's transporting to Golgi apparatus, and the Golgi apparatus can transport or deliver the protein, lipid, or another biomolecules to another organelle inside cell, and also transmit or deliver to outside cell. The next one is mitochondrion. If we talk about mitochondrion, the mitochondrion is organelle which can produce the energy to survive the cell and to make the cell ready in function. So in mitochondrion, mostly it produce glucose from carbohydrates and deliver it as energy for the cell. And the last one is chloroplast. Chloroplast can be found in plant cell. It can produce energy or food through photosynthesis process, also release oxygen to the environment. So the chloroplast is the most important cell organelle in the world, because it releases oxygen to other organisms, also produce energy or food which can consume for other organisms too. Okay, in the last we talk about biomolecules. Cells actually can produce some substances, and we said or we call the substances as biomolecules. Okay, the first one we talk about carbohydrate. This is the most biomolecules in nature, and these biomolecules can be formed by photosynthesis process in chloroplast. Carbohydrates actually has function serve as main energy source of cell. So the carbohydrates, as if we classified it by the complexity of its structure, so we make two type of carbohydrates. The first one is simple carbohydrates, and the second one is complex carbohydrates. Simple carbohydrates uh, can be break down becomes two type, is monosaccharides and disaccharides, and the complex carbohydrate is polysaccharides. Monosaccharides mostly we can find as glucose, fructose, and galactose, like in sugar. We find it in sugar. And disaccharides we found at maltose, lactose, and sucrose. We can find it like in milk. And the last one, polysaccharides, it's we found it as starch, fibers, or glycogen. So it more complex. Simple carbohydrates is easier to absorb by cells and use as the first energy or primary energy source. And polysaccharides mostly more difficult to proceed or to metabolism by cells. So mostly it will be stored for reserve energy of cells. Okay, the next biomolecules is protein. We know the protein is biopolymeric structures composed by multi-amino acids. If we talk about protein, it has different function. The first one is structural proteins. It has function to develop the cell. So sometimes cell is broken and need to redevelop. So it needs structural proteins. The next one is enzymes. Enzyme is a catalyst to proceed some activities in the cell, like metabolism or produce carbohydrates, proteins also, and lipid. Next one is hormones. Hormone has a function to control uh, the different function of cell. So hormones will, like in our body, it work with brain, so it will control our condition based on the brain process. Other function is respiratory proteins is related with the respiratory system, respiration in our body. The next one is transport proteins relating with blood process or fluid process, or maybe food transfer, food deliver in our body. Next one is contract proteins, storage proteins, and the last one is toxin. Toxin is related with how to these proteins to control bacteria or maybe some disrupted to our body. And if we talk about protein structure, we have four protein structure: primary protein structure, secondary protein structure, tertiary protein structure, and quaternary protein structure. Primary protein structure is like simple chain, the sequence chain of amino acids that make a form of simple chains. And the secondary protein structure, it's when the chain is folded. So when the chain is folded by hydrogen bonding, so the amino acids will make folding and repeating the pattern. So mostly in secondary protein structure, the protein make a pleated sheet or alpha helix. And the tertiary protein structure is three-dimensional folding. If secondary protein structure is simple folding, two-dimensional, the tertiary protein structure is three-dimensional folding. So the pattern is more complicated. The three-dimensional folding pattern, it's developed by the side chain interaction between amino acids. And the last one is quaternary protein structure. It's made by protein consisting of more than one amino acid chain. So if there are two or three amino acid chains, it's contact or interacted, so it will be develop a quaternary protein structure. Okay, the next one is lipid. If we talk about lipid, we talk about fat, sterol, and phospholipid. Lipid actually a group of organic compounds which we can find as fats, oils, hormone, and certain components of membranes. But these organic compounds of lipid has specific characteristic. It dissolves in alcohol but cannot dissolve in water. Lipid has function as a source of stored metabolic energy. Also, it develop permeability barriers in biological membranes, like in cell membranes. We talked in the first that cell membrane has semi-permeable membrane. So it means in the cell membrane, it contains some lipid. uh, Lipids can classified by three kinds of lipids. The first one is fat. Uh, we know this fat is triglycerides. It actually can be classified by consumed fat and stored fat. The next one is sterols. Maybe you're familiar with cholesterol. So actually cholesterol is not mostly negative because cholesterol can develop cell membranes, nerve sheaths, bile, hormones, and D vitamin. The last one is phospholipid. Phospholipid is has function as lecithin and cell membranes. Phospholipid in cell membranes has two type of lipid. The first one is hydrophilic in head and saturated fatty acid and unsaturated fatty acid in feet. So when hydrophilic head, it means can absorb water, but saturated and unsaturated fatty acid is difficult to absorb water. And the last one, our biomolecules is nucleic acid. Nucleic acid actually is a polynucleotide. we know that nucleotide is components in nucleus. So when nucleotide is interacted and make a chain, it will transform into nucleic acid. The function of nucleic acid is for containment information or carrying molecules of the cell. So it will determine the inherited characteristic of every organism. Nucleic acid, based on their structure, we can classify it became two types. The first one is DNA, deoxyribonucleic acid, and the second one is RNA, ribonucleic acid. Deoxyribonucleic acid is a couple of nucleic acid chain. The RNA is single chain of nucleic acid. The difference between DNA and RNA, if we talk about nucleotides component, DNA has adenine, guanine, cytosine, and thymine. But RNA doesn't have thymine, it uses uracil as base of its chains. DNA has couple of chains, and RNA only single chain of nucleic acid. DNA mostly we can find in nucleus or nucleoid, but also in mitochondria. But RNA mainly we find at cytoplasm. If we talk about shape, the DNA has storing genetic information, RNA transform and transport proteins. So if DNA determine the characteristic of cell, RNA has function only to transform or transport protein. So it's different. In other case, RNA we can find also in virus. So why virus can break a nucleus or a cell? Because RNA will enter the cell to cytoplasm, and next one it's also enter the nucleus. When RNA of virus enter the nucleus, it will break the couple chain of DNA and make a linkage with the half of DNA and transform into new DNA. So after that, the DNA origin of cell become broken and change to DNA of virus. So after that, the virus will control the cell. After that, mostly the virus will make duplicate of cells of new cell of virus. So the virus will spread in our body. Okay, I think it's enough about our discussion or our talk about introduction to cell in this session. I hope it can encourage your knowledge and your study about life science. Bye bye.